According to an explosive report in Axios, Donald Trump is planning for the complete takeover of Kharg Island. And the report, which is based on statements from 4 unnamed US officials, suggests the move would be part of an effort to open up the Strait of Hormuz. Kharg Island has long been an obsession of the Trump administration. The island, which is located just off the Iranian coast in the Persian Gulf, processes 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. And it's vital for the Iranian oil industry as deep-sea oil tankers can safely embark there. So the immediate Iranian coast in the Persian Gulf is too shallow for those giant tankers. And that means Iran has built pipelines from all its major oil fields. That's transported to Kharg Island, and then that oil is then processed and loaded onto ships via specialized tanker jetties. You can see them there on the eastern side of the island. So could taking Kharg Island be the key that unlocks the Strait of Hormuz? That's what Trump hopes, and the sources who spoke to Axios also think so. So someone described as a source with knowledge of the White House's thinking said this: "We need about a month to weaken the Iranians more with strikes, take the island, and then get them by the balls and use it for negotiations." So saying, well, we've got Kharg Island. If you reopen the strait, we'll give it back. Is that what is it supposed to be a hostage situation? I'm not quite sure. Another person described as a senior administration official said this: Trump wants Hormuz open. If he has to take Kharg Island to make it happen, that's going to happen. If he decides to have a coastal invasion, that's going to happen. But that decision hasn't been made. So this is kind of briefings to Axios. I mean, it sounds like to try and make the Trump administration sound very tough. And I don't know if these briefings are the briefings of real plans or they are sort of an attempt to intimidate the Iranians. Either way, not everyone is convinced this kind of economic pressure on Iran would have the White House's desired effect. Esfandyar Batmanghelidj is CEO of the Bourse and Bazaar think tank. He's written a fascinating piece in the magazine Foreign Policy titled "Iran Can Afford America's Economic Warfare." And I spoke to him earlier today to discuss the argument. We talked about Iran's advantage in cheap drone production, how Americans misunderstand the nature of Iran's economy, and how escalation in the Strait of Hormuz would affect prices everywhere throughout the globe. I began, though, by asking about that latest update on Trump's apparent plans to take over Kharg Island.
The president seems to be under a lot of pressure from, I assume, people within his administration, but also figures like Lindsey Graham, who've been very vocal about the idea that taking Kharg Island would be a kind of easy pathway to victory. And the idea here is that there's a view in Washington that Iran is funding its war through its oil exports. And the island is critical as the main terminal for around 90% of Iran's oil exports. If the US can seize the island, they would be able to basically halt Iran's oil trade. I think there is pressure growing as well because while the Iranians have, quote unquote, closed the Strait of Hormuz, there have been reports that they have been able to move some of their own tankers carrying Iranian crude out of the Persian Gulf and towards customers in China. So that has, I think, wounded some pride in Washington, and also given this impression that, if you are able to halt the oil exports, you might be able to halt Iran's war machine.
Why is that wrong, though, unless you do agree? I mean, from what you've said there, it sounds like if you want to beat Iran, that would be a sensible thing to do.
I think the misunderstanding here that exists among American policymakers, and this is something that's been kind of baked in for a long time, is that on one hand, they misunderstand the composition of the Iranian economy and the size of the Iranian economy. And on the other hand, they misunderstand the kind of efficiency and the sort of small amount of military expenditure that Iran is actually undertaking in order to create this threat and to pursue things like the war that's unfolding right now. And so to give you some more context, I mean, when we look at the composition of the Iranian economy, oil is very important. It is the majority source for Iran's foreign exchange earnings. It is the backbone of government expenditure. However, Iran, unlike other countries in the Persian Gulf, has a diversified economy, and there is a large non-oil industrial sector that is also part of the backbone of the Iranian economy. And so, even if you're able to squeeze oil exports, and we have some historical precedent here, oil exports came down dramatically in 2019 in the period in which the Trump administration had first started their maximum pressure sanctions. That doesn't mean that Iran's economy is going to collapse immediately. It does create significant pain, economic pain for the country. But when we're talking about whether or not the war is going to last for weeks or months, Iran will be able to persist in its fight even if the oil exports are halted. And this leads to the second observation, which is that the reason they can do this is that it is not expensive for Iran to maintain the kind of operational tempo that they have, because Iran is a country that has, relative to other countries in the region, and certainly relative to Israel and the United States, been spending a lot less on its military. So the most recent data we have is for 2024 from the Iranian budget of that year. This is data that's compiled by CIPRI, and if you look at the total Iranian military expenditure, it's $8 billion a year. Now, to put that into context, the Pentagon has reportedly just asked the White House to push forward a supplemental budget addition of $200 billion to fund the Iran war. So Iran is spending a tiny fraction of what its adversaries are, and that has to do with sort of the nature of the capabilities that they've developed in recent years.
Your argument is that these drones that they're using, especially the drones are the cheap things, right, are so cheap that even if you cut off their oil exports, they'll still be able to continue the war. I mean, I suppose there are also 90 million people, and if you cut off the oil exports, yeah, maybe you can still make the drones, but can you keep an economy of 90 million people functioning? Would you not end up with, I suppose, a currency crisis if oil could no longer be exported?
Well, Iran's been in a kind of ongoing currency crisis for about a decade. But I mean, you've pointed out exactly the trade-off, Michael, which is that for Iranian authorities, they have a choice now about moving towards a war economy, which means actually choosing to cannibalize the civilian economy, the normal economy of the country, in order to maintain the war effort in the face of these significant pressures, like the potential impact of US military action on oil exports. But to actually give you another data point here, if you look at that military expenditure of $8 billion a year and you look at it on a per capita basis, it's around $90 per Iranian citizen. And so one way of thinking about this is that if the Iranian government needed to scrounge up more money to keep this war effort going, even as the economy is contracting, what they essentially have to do to even just double which is a big target, double military expenditure in this situation, is find another $90 per Iranian citizen. And, Iran is a reasonably wealthy country by global standards. It's a kind of upper middle income country. There is wealth and there is a real kind of economic base. And while that economic base may be contracting, a larger share of production and economic activity can be diverted to the war effort than we have seen in recent years. And that gives the Iranian government a lot of space to basically continue to prioritize this war, even as the sort of overall economic picture darkens.
In your piece in Foreign Policy magazine, Iran Can Afford America's Economic Warfare, if I understood it correctly, you suggested that sort of cutting off oil exports might not be as significant as people think. But if the Americans and the Israelis were to go straight directly for Iran's industrial base, that could cause some serious problems. So if they went for power plants or steel mills, if they went directly for Iran's industrial capacity, explain that argument and whether or not you think it's plausible that they might go for those kind of targets.
Well, we've already seen an indication that the president is being given those options. So, the Israelis did strike a critical natural gas processing facility, the South Pars facility, on Wednesday. So we know that it's something that is being considered. But I think the distinction here is that the way that the administration has historically framed the question of Iranian revenues and the relationship of those revenues to the threat that Iran poses is basically one of flows. So the US has tried to interfere with flows of trade, financial flows, in order to sort of throttle the Iranian economy. The Trump administration embarked on this with its maximum pressure sanctions starting in 2018. We've had 8 years of those sanctions now. And I think the fact that we are in this conflict is in some ways a reflection that, you know, on one hand, throttling Iran's trade was not enough to kind of cripple the economy in a way that reduced the threat that Iran poses, and at the same time introduced its own escalatory dynamics. You know, the US has basically been engaged in economic war on Iran for the last 8 years, and the inability to break out of that cycle and move towards diplomacy and a mutual understanding is partly why we're facing this war right now. But the shift to targeting infrastructure is not about flows, it's about stocks. It's about the actual capital stock of the country, the power plants, industrial facilities that are the backbone of the economy. And if the US and Israel decide to go and decisively shorten this war by eliminating Iran's capacity to kind of maintain any normal economic function, certainly they could target those infrastructures. However, doing so would, I think, open a new phase in the conflict, which is again something we saw previewed on Wednesday, which is that Iran would then respond in kind by targeting those kinds of infrastructures in a more sort of decisive way than we have seen so far. The attack made in retaliation for the South Pars strike on the LNG facility in Qatar has, according to the management at Qatar Energy, knocked 17% of the production capacity of the most important LNG facility in the world offline. So you can imagine that those kinds of incidents would multiply if the US and Israel decide to target that civilian infrastructure. My argument is that, yes, that may shorten the duration of the war because that is a kind of critical impact on Iran's economic viability, but it would also intensify the war for that shorter period in ways that may actually mean that in the long run, in the short run and long run, the global economy would face even more significant costs than had the war sort of continued at this plateau for that longer period.
And talk about what the consequences would be for the rest of the world if, just a huge proportion of the Gulf's energy infrastructure, so in the Gulf states, in Iran, Saudi Arabia, if a large proportion of that is damaged, what does that mean for oil? What does it mean for natural gas? What does it mean for fertilizers for the entire global economy?
I'm sure your viewers and listeners have been following these reports about all of the disruptions that are starting to become clear because of this conflict. As you just mentioned, the what we are sort of realizing through this war, for those that maybe didn't pay as much attention to the Middle East and its recent economic development, is that these countries are producing oil and natural gas in large quantities, of course, but there are many other kind of economic functions that are played by the Gulf states that make the Persian Gulf region very important for the global economy. Um, Ultimately, I think there's two things that we're looking at here. One is that if the war intensifies and more critical infrastructure is damaged, the knock-on effects for global markets will be even more profound than what we're seeing. So we've already seen elevated oil prices, elevated prices of refined fuels, elevated prices of things like fertilizer, and disruptions in global supply chains because shipping and aviation are really interrupted through the kind of the critical hubs that we have in the Persian Gulf. So all of that will get worse. But I think on top of that, what we're facing here is a very grim prospect that these countries that had become important parts of kind of the global economic growth story would be pushed on a much more negative trajectory. So to give you one example, something that I think is somewhat unheralded, but the Gulf states, yes, of course, they're major oil producers, but they have also actually been major investors in green and sort of green transition projects in the global south. So, one of the largest operators of renewable energy assets in the world is a Saudi company, Aqua Power. Emirati company Masdar is also a major operator of solar projects in countries in East Africa, Central Asia, and so forth. And so I think the prospect here is also that if you undermine the prosperity of the Gulf states, you're actually undermining the prosperity of all of the countries in which they have emerged as a significant player, providing financing and expertise necessary to build critical infrastructure. So the knock-on effects, I think, are quite significant, and this is itself a strong argument for why we would all hope that this war ends sooner rather than later, because we can't really afford for this damage to multiply.
And when will, I mean, obviously in the region, the effects are already being felt, with great severity. When will sort of, ordinary people, I suppose, feel those ripple out in Europe, Asia, North America? I'm just thinking when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was sort of an immediate spike in inflation. Within 6 months, inflation was at 10%, which was completely unheard of for decades. So far, I keep seeing headlines that this is, an Armageddon moment when it comes to oil markets. I think sort of petrol at the pump is up a bit, but the response to me seems somewhat muted. Maybe it's just because I don't drive, but I suppose I want you to speak to that. When will it trickle out to ordinary people?
I think it has to do with this kind of lag effect. So ultimately, we're dealing with supply chains that you know we that involve a lot of sort of intermediate steps. So if we talk about something like fertilizer that is currently being shipped out of the Persian Gulf, and maybe those shipments are being interrupted, that fertilizer ultimately has to go to the farmers where it's being used, and as part of the sowing process, then we have to wait for the crop yields when it's harvest time later in the year, and then we'll start to understand whether a reduction in crop yields in many different parts of the world has a knock-on effect on food prices. So, this is in some ways a little bit different than the crisis that we saw with Ukraine, because, in some ways, the Ukraine crisis had a single point of critical pressure, which was the energy price that was available to consumers in Europe. Here, what we're talking about is really the interruption of this web of supply chains where, when it comes back to what someone might actually start feeling in Europe, it's going to take some time for some of that pain to be recognized. But, I think you listen to traders in the energy markets or executives from large energy companies, and, they've been very clear that this is an unprecedented crisis, and the amount of supply that has been taken off the market because of the disruptions of the Persian Gulf is far more significant than the amount of supply that was interrupted from Ukraine. So even if we're not feeling the pain as immediately, from the standpoint of like the normal operation of the global economy, this probably will end up being a more significant kind of seismic event.
And I know because you study sort of energy markets in detail, I want to sort of take advantage of having you here and sort of break down some of the different sources of energy and how they are economically different, I suppose. So as far as I understand it, the oil market is pretty much global. So oil will be a similar price everywhere. The gas market is much more localized because it's harder to transport. So the reason that the war in Ukraine affected Europe so much is because we get so much of our gas directly through pipes from Russia, and they stopped transporting gas. I don't know where fertilizer stands in that, but I wonder if you could sort of pass the differences here and what regions will be most affected by the effect on these different sources of energy or resources in the form of fertilizers.
For the sake of your listeners, I wouldn't necessarily position myself as an energy markets expert, but I think actually, Michael, your breakdown was exactly right. So part of the question here in terms of where we're going to see the most profound impacts is what goods are most tradable, where you can move them very easily between countries. So, the difference between natural gas and oil is that oil you can load onto a tanker. Natural gas typically delivered to customers via pipelines, with the exception of LNG, liquefied natural gas, which in recent years has seen investments so that it can become more mobile, like oil. And this has to do with whether we're talking about disruptions to regional markets or global markets. And ultimately, I think to give you a sense of the significance of what's happening in the Gulf, the port of Jebel Ali in the UAE is one of the top 10 most important container ports in the world. So a lot of goods that are leaving the sort of Gulf states and Iran will actually pass through Jebel Ali. They'll move to Jebel Ali through feeder services, and then they'll be sort of put onto larger container ships to be taken to markets abroad. But almost more importantly, it's also a kind of a conduit for trade coming from East Asia, particularly from China, to the Middle East, Central Asia, but also to, for example, East Africa. And so when we talk about that port no longer being able to manage any throughput, meaning its sort of utilization goes down because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, you're basically interfering with the operation of supply chains that don't even originate in the Middle East. They just pass through the Middle East. Similarly, we could talk about the airports in Doha and Dubai, where around 10% of global air freight pass through those airports. So, looking at the hierarchy here, there are definitely goods leaving the Middle East that are very sort of easy to move around, like the oil, like the LNG, like fertilizers, and sort of petrochemical products that can be put onto tankers or container ships. But at the same time, the disruptions aren't just limited to that. It's also about the fact that you have these hubs for global logistics that are in that region that now can no longer be used. And to kind of maybe make this more, explain the significance of this, this is really the first time, and I kind of wrote this observation in an earlier foreign policy piece. It's really the first time since the Second World War that a military conflict has directly disrupted cities that play the role as global hubs for trade, finance, and I think that is something that part of the reason why we're having a hard time maybe fully understanding the ramifications here is that we're actually not used to a place like Dubai and to a lesser extent Doha, Riyadh getting impacted this way by a war.
Yeah, I've heard sort of people say that if war does break out between China and Taiwan, maybe Singapore would end up playing the role of the UAE, and then we'll really see what happens when global trade flows are interrupted. I want to talk about another article you wrote over the last fortnight, which is incredibly interesting. Drones like bicycles, and it was for Phenomenal World. And in it, you were trying to get to the bottom of how much it actually does cost in Iran to produce a Shahed 136 kamikaze drone, which are the drones that the Iranians are using and causing so much damage. I think the Russians build a version themselves. And I suppose the argument you're making is that this is a new kind of warfare, really, where states which are on paper much poorer, much weaker than the great powers, are able to build very cheaply in great numbers a weapon which can cause just an incredible amount of disruption and is very expensive to repel. And that's what we're seeing when it comes to Iran, with very cheap drones that are able to shut down one of the most important trading routes in the world. And even with all their interceptors and the most high-tech militaries in the world, Israel and the Americans aren't really able to do much to stop them. And I suppose I wanted to ask you how you think this will change geopolitics in general. Does the invention or the development of these cheap drones just make what once looked like weaker states much more powerful? Do they have a much stronger deterrent now against more traditionally great powers dominating them?
I think so. And I mean, we already saw indications of this actually in the Ukraine war, where although the story is often positioned as, Russia's drones being used to great devastation in Ukraine, the resilience of the Ukrainian armed forces, the ability of the Ukrainian defense industry to tool itself up to persist in the war against a much larger adversary like Russia, I mean, that is a kind of asymmetry that we're also seeing in this new war between Iran and Israel and the United States. And I think this notion of asymmetries analytically is very important here. And there are so many asymmetries that we can talk about. So, I mentioned one already, which is that, when we look at sort of defense expenditure between Iran, Israel, and the US, it's a dramatically different picture. I mentioned that Iran is spending around $90 per capita in terms of its military expenditure. The US is spending around $2,500. Israel is spending $5,000. So a completely different scale of military expenditure relative to the size of a population. Similar picture when you look at relative to the size of the economy. Another asymmetry here, of course, is that you have two nuclear powers, Israel and the US, attacking a state that equivocated in actually developing a nuclear deterrent and now maybe is paying the price in some sense. But then it kind of goes all the way down to even the basic missile weapon system. So, the Shahed drone that this piece was about, which has become kind of the symbol of Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz, cause havoc for the global economy. I mean, it's such a rudimentary weapons platform compared to something like an F-35 fighter or, the aircraft carriers that are being deployed to the region. And yet, Iran is still able to project a threat using these relatively basic platforms. The point of the piece was actually that in some ways, I think the problem, I mean, US military planners have been aware of these asymmetries. About 6 years ago, the Defense Intelligence Agency put out its kind of public version of its assessments of Iran's military capabilities. And the message was, as it had been in previous iterations of that report, that Iran has no conventional military. It has no air force, which we've seen because Israel and the US have total superiority in the air. It has no real sort of uh, armored divisions to speak of. I mean, it doesn't have tanks the way that other countries have tanks because it could neither buy them nor effectively produce them. But the systems that it has been able to produce are basically ballistic missiles and drones and other forms of UAVs, for example, naval versions of drones. And this was a conscious decision on the part of Iranian military planners. They knew they were going to have hard limits to their military expenditure. They knew that they were going to face difficulties procuring advanced weapons from the major producers around the world because of the arms embargo that had been in place for most of the last 20 years. And they also knew that they needed to develop capabilities that could be produced sort of indigenously and in large quantities to give them an ability to deter possible attacks from the US and Israel, who have been talking about militarily interfering or intervening in Iran for the better part of 2 decades. So all of this kind of spurred a development of a doctrine within Iran that favored these cheap systems. The irony is that, as I write in my piece, I actually think that US military planners um, and sort of the defense analytical community have probably been overstating the costs of these systems because they've been relying on fairly basic assessments of what it would cost to make such a drone in Europe or in the US without taking into consideration dynamics within Iran. I had this hunch. I contacted a colleague in Tehran who works on defense issues. He asked around. He came back with a certain price that seemed to confirm my hunch about what a Shahed drone might actually cost. It's very hard to verify that number, so I can't swear by it, but I can say that in the piece, I try and do an analysis of, what it costs to produce a piece of equipment in Iran versus the US. And you basically get this 5-to-1 ratio. So if you build something in the US, it's going to cost 1/5 of the price to build it in Iran. And again, this points to that fundamental asymmetry that has become sort of the key story of this conflict.
I want to end on an unfair question, just because I think it's interesting for sort of viewers to see how someone's sort of analytical framework helps them to at least guess what might happen in the future. But from where you're standing at the moment, where do you see this going? I mean, I said it was an unfair question. Do you see sort of Trump tacoing and saying, oh, actually, I'm declaring victory? Or do you think that we could see the kind of total escalation, which would see, I mean, basically the destruction of the entire region?
I've wavered on this, and I think it really depends on the day. the most frustrating thing about this conflict is that, we are dealing with a leadership in the United States that has really no sense of its goals, where you have a commander in chief who cannot consistently articulate even what he seems to be thinking about this conflict. I mean, it really changes in every interview. Every time a journalist manages to get him on his phone number, which seems to have been circulated to everyone at this point, he says something different about whether this war is going to continue or end. And so the assumption has long been that the economic costs will get so great that Trump will have to capitulate because, enough people will basically pick up the phone to him, including, the billionaire class that he is sort of enmeshed with. And they're going to say, you've won, you've killed the supreme leader, you've killed a whole host of Iran's top leadership, you've decimated their military, take the victory, let's basically call it quits now. But unfortunately, whether or not it's unclear whether those conversations have been happening, although I assume they have been, it has been insufficient to convince him. And the other thing I would highlight here is that, the US in many ways has been preparing for this war for a long time. I mean, this is, since Bush's kind of axis of evil speech in 2002, this has been a scenario that, although the US looks quite unprepared for how it's actually played out, at least the instinct that it is appropriate and necessary to fight a war with the United States has been quite baked in. I mean, every president prior to Trump has made it very clear that this option has been on the table and that the plans are ready, and they have done military exercises to demonstrate their readiness. And so what I'm getting at here is that there's almost a kind of muscle memory or a certain kind of inertia that is inherent in this conflict. And I think what's concerning for me is that, you know, on one hand, Trump may chicken out and this war comes to some kind of very tenuous ceasefire or close. I'm not sure that the conditions have been, or that the war has played out in such a way that basically the US will have, for lack of a better phrase, gotten it out of its system. That the US will have learned the lessons of this conflict, which is that, you know, it is no longer possible to wage a war in the Middle East, certainly not against an adversary like Iran, without there being significant blowback for allies in the region and for the global economy. And until that lesson is really learned, and this is the lesson that Iran is trying to kind of teach through its effort to externalize the war, to kind of escalate against US aggression, then unfortunately, I think we could end up in this very uneasy dynamic where, particularly because the leadership in Iran will remain, and Trump may not have been chastened by this experience, that we could end up having a war like this again at some point. Consolidating a ceasefire into a durable peace is going to be incredibly difficult.
I basically sort of share your analysis. My hope is that people get through to Donald Trump and say, now's the time to walk away, declare victory. My fear is that it's sort of, in a way, beyond his control now, because even in terms of, obviously going into the war was irrational from the perspective of sort of America's strategic interest. But now they're in the war, extricating themselves while the Islamic Republic is still in place. And they have basically just the absolute incentive now to build a nuclear weapon because it's the only thing that they think will stop America bombing them again. It does make it feel like it's not actually, I keep hearing people say it's Trump's decision when to leave, but I feel now that America is in, maybe this is because Israel tricked them into this situation, that's precisely what they wanted. Can America extract itself now, knowing that sort of all arrows point to Iran getting a nuclear weapon the moment this is over?
I mean, the question of whether Iran will go for a nuclear weapon and whether they can do that in a way, whether they can succeed in that effort without just basically ending up being attacked again. I mean, that's a very difficult thing to game out, basically. And I mean, it's very hard for me to say one way or another, but I think, Michael, the point that you're raising is the right one, which is that this, I mean, the war itself has deepened the crisis. So this was an eminently solvable set of problems even last year, especially before the June war when Israel struck during the nuclear negotiations, you know, this was something that diplomacy could solve: the mutual threat perception, the concern over Iran's nuclear program, the animosity to a large extent between the US and Iran, the inability to find areas of mutual interest or mutual dependencies that would help kind of foster some more durable peace, as I had just put it. So, you know, it was all solvable and there were efforts to solve it. I think, unfortunately, it didn't happen for various reasons, which are ultimately quite political. Now it will be even more difficult to solve these problems. The leaders, for example, that had been largely supportive of some degree of engagement with the US, for example, Ali Larijani in Iran, he's been killed now. And Iran will be coming out of this conflict not simply looking for a new sort of understanding with the United States, but also facing the real challenge of having to rebuild and reconstruct after a war. And there will be traumas and a lot of significant political turmoil within Iran simply because a war has unfolded in the country. And so, domestically, it will be challenging. And then in the international context, the the countries that were very supportive of diplomacy, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, to a lesser extent the UAE, now maybe have a more ambivalent view because there are many voices in those systems that are saying, you know what, we need to eliminate the Islamic Republic once and for all to eliminate this threat. So it's a really complex, I think, picture. And, if anything, the international community is going to have to prioritize the resolution of this uh, in order to find some way forward. But the other pattern that we've seen in recent years is that probably 6 months from now, there will be a new global crisis that will overshadow this Iran story, the same way that Iran has overshadowed, the peace building or the attempts to kind of rectify the situation after the genocide in Gaza, overshadowed the situation in Syria. I mean, Lebanon is being devastated right now and is somewhat invisible. And then, of course, Russia and Ukraine as being another flashpoint, let alone the violence and instability taking place across much of Africa at the moment. So, we're at a moment of profound global disorder, and this war has only taken us further down towards some kind of chaos.